Holder elbowed his way past Kutcher and stepped into the galley. He leaned against the countertop, pushed his glasses up to the bridge of his nose, and locked eyes with Kutcher. Every trace of kindness was now gone from his gaze. "You have 2 minutes," he said. Kutcher did not hesitate to obey the note's final instruction. She headed for the cockpit. So I'll leave you with that cliffhanger and ask if you have any questions.
coming out tonight. We're really glad that you decided to spend your Thursday evening with us. If you haven't been here before, we are an independent bookstore that relies on you guys. So if you're browsing around or you feel inclined to buy Brendan's book, we would appreciate that so that we can keep our events free. Cell phones, if we can silence those too before we get started. But other than that, we are so excited to have Brendan Kerner here to talk about his new book, The Skies Belong to Us. Brendan's a contributing writer to Wired magazine as well as a columnist for the New York Times and Slate. So if you can join me in welcoming Brendan.
Thank you. This means a lot to me. I'm actually born and raised in Los Angeles, so it's pretty awesome to be reading to y'all tonight. I want to tell you guys first a little bit about how I found this story in this book, The Skies Belong to Us. In October 2009, I was reading the New York Times Metro section, and I saw this little, 616-word story about this guy named Luis Armando Peña Soltron. He'd been this Puerto Rican nationalist in the 60s, living in the Bronx. And in 1968, he and two of his comrades hijacked a plane to Cuba, from New York to Cuba. And he spent the next 41 years, actually, living in Cuba, until suddenly, in 2009, he decided to come back to the US. And so this piece was about him being arrested the second he stepped off the plane at JFK. There's a couple things about this that appealed to me. I think the first is that I've always been attracted to stories about fugitives and exiles. My first book was about an American GI who went native with a tribe of headhunters in Burma during World War II. And second of all, I was just kind of amazed that a hijacker could be on the run for 41 years, because I think now, in the climate we're in, hijacking is like one of the scariest, most taboo crimes you can possibly imagine. And I was kind of vaguely aware that there had been this time period in history where people had hijacked planes to Cuba. There's like a famous Monty Python sketch about it. But I didn't really know too much about it. It kind of predates my birth. And so I decided to look into this era, and I was just overwhelmed by the sheer number of hijackings that were going on in the late 60s and early 70s. They were going on 40, 50 a year sometimes, sometimes twice a day. I was particularly intrigued by the cases where people went on the lam for many years and actually got away with it, because skyjackers in general, their skyjacking ended with them in prison the next day. So I was looking at a list of all these fugitives from that era, and it's predominantly an all-male list. Skyjacking was very much a male pursuit, but there was one name that stuck out at me, and that was Catherine Marie Kirko, who had been 20 years old at the time of the hijacking and had been from a small town called Coos Bay, Oregon. And she's actually the woman pictured here on the side of the book. And I was, at first intrigued because she stuck out because she was a woman, but also, she was a 20-year-old, very young, no obvious reason to hijack a plane and turn your back on everything you'd ever known to do this completely bonkers thing. So my interest in that became this obsession that took me 4 years to write this book that I'm going to share with you all tonight. Now I want to start by giving you a little background about what I call the epidemic of hijacking in America. From 1961 to 1972, there were 159 flights hijacked in America. And I try to think of it as an epidemic, and that there's this first phase, which lasts from about 1961 to 1969. And it's pretty much everyone at this time who hijacks a plane wants only one thing, and that's they want to go to Cuba. There was actually one guy who wanted to go to Smackover, Arkansas to reconcile with his estranged wife. But he's the exception that proves the rule. But generally, everyone wanted to go to Cuba, which they thought would be this glorious workers' paradise where they would get this big parade down the Central Avenue in Havana. It never worked out like that for them, actually. Most of them ended up in prison, some of them in this little dormitory called Hijacker's House in southern Havana. Others at sugar harvesting gulags on the southern coast of Cuba. Now the airlines, while this madness was going on with all these crazy people hijacking planes to Cuba, had a choice. Now at this time there was absolutely zero security. You could literally walk from the curbside all the way often at the top of the boarding stairs or even onto your plane without showing a ticket, without having ID, without anyone even remotely asking to look, what you're carrying. So you could carry anything on a flight. And so the airlines, in the midst of all these hijackings, had a choice. They could either pay millions of dollars to pay for metal detectors and security personnel to staff them. And not only that, but they were scared that if they searched everyone, people would be really freaked out. And they did not want to be treated like criminal suspects for merely getting on a plane. They could do that, or they could put up with 20 to 40 hijackings a year and just completely comply with everything the hijackers wanted. And then they would get the planes back, and the passengers wouldn't be hurt, and everything would be fine. It would be much cheaper than having security. So in this first passage I'm going to read to you, I'm going to kind of explain why treating skyjacking as a managed risk actually wasn't that smart. The airline's harm reduction strategy was contingent on the assumption that the epidemic's basic features would never change. that the perpetrators would always be either sad sacks or Cuban exiles whose sole intent was to reach Havana with a minimum of fuss. But as the hijackings piled up with little apparent resistance from the airlines or the authorities, the crime's appeal broadened to new demographics of the disenchanted. The epidemic first revealed its metamorphosis on the second day of 1969, when a young African-American couple, Tyrone and Linda Austin, took over an Eastern Airlines flight en route from New York to Miami. Tyrone was the aggressor, announcing the hijacking by holding a gun to the head of a 2-year-old boy and shouting, "Black Power, Havana! Black Power, Havana!" Though the Austins' revolutionary credentials were sketchy, Tyrone's real objective was to flee a felony arrest warrant in New Jersey. Their success in drawing media attention would soon inspire more sincere black militants to embrace skyjacking as a key tactic in their struggle. Later that month, a 19-year-old Navy deserter hijacked a national airlines flight from Key West to Havana, telling a stewardess at knife point that he refused to shed blood in Vietnam. It was the first American hijacking in which a member of the military cited his opposition to the war as a motive. It would by no means be the last. By the second week of February 1969, 11 flights had been commandeered in the U.S., a record pace. In addition to the Austins and the Navy deserter, the hijackers included a former mental patient accompanied by his 3-year-old son, a community college student armed with a can of bug spray, a Purdue University dropout with a taste for Marxist economics, and a retired Green Beret who claimed that he intended to assassinate Fidel Castro with his bare hands. At the behest of the House Committee on Interstate and Foreign Commerce, the FAA formed a special anti-hijacking task force to develop possible solutions to the crisis. The group was immediately inundated with thousands of letters from concerned citizens, who recommended inventive ways to frustrate skyjackers, installing trap doors outside cockpits, arming stewardesses with tranquilizer darts, making passengers wear boxing gloves so they couldn't grip guns, playing the Cuban national anthem before takeoff, and then arresting anyone who knew the lyrics. The most popular suggestion was for the FAA to build a mock version of Havana's Jose Marti International Airport in a South Florida field, so that skyjackers could be duped into thinking they had reached Havana. The idea sparked serious interest at the agency, but was ultimately discarded as too expensive. As the FAA's task force sifted through the mountain of proposals, the hijackings continued apace, each more outlandish than the last. A 74-year-old World War I veteran pulled a knife on an Eastern stewardess in the skies above South Carolina. A Black Panther, wanted for his role in a San Francisco shootout, hijacked a TWA Boeing 707 over Nevada. An alcoholic used car dealer from Baltimore took over an Eastern flight while wearing Bermuda shorts and sandals so that he could hit the beach upon landing in Havana. So shortly after this time period as described there's one of which I think are two really milestone hijackings which have now been largely forgotten. In November 1969, there was an Italian-American Marine named Raphael Minichiello, born in Italy and moved here and served in Vietnam and been wounded, earned a Purple Heart. Came back to the U.S. and got involved in a pay dispute with the Marines. And when things did not go to his satisfaction, he decided to hijack a plane, LAX to SFO plane. And his demand, he didn't want to go to Cuba. He was the first to not want to go to Cuba. He wanted to go to his native Italy. No one ever asked to do this before. It was a brand new thing. But TWA, the airline involved, had a policy of total compliance, so they actually let him go to Rome. He flew to JFK first, then to Bangor, Maine, and Shannon, Ireland, and eventually to Rome, where he was greeted as a hero by the Italian public, which understood why he felt this whole dispute was a grave affront to his honor. In fact, he ended up serving just a few months in jail. When he got out, he signed a contract to star in a spaghetti western movie. So after this, after the hijacking, the hijackers realized that, we can hijack planes anywhere. So planes start going all over the world. Then in June 1970, you have a man named Arthur Gates Barkley, an unemployed truck driver who had once delivered Twinkies and for a living, had been involved in an IRS dispute for 7 years over a $471 tax bill. And when he is frustrated in that effort, he decides to hijack a plane from Phoenix to Washington, D.C., where he demands $100 million in cash to be paid to him by the Supreme Court directly. Now, TWA doesn't have $100 million in hand, but they decide to try to mollify him with $100,000. And though that ends with Arthur Gates Barkley being shot, This gives hijackers the idea that all of a sudden, hey, they'll give us money too. And so this leads to this last phase of the epidemic, the craziest phase, which I really write about at great length in The Skies Belong to Us. And that's 1972, this kind of like crazy extortion, let's go anywhere in the world phase. And I write about a lot of hijackings from that era, from that year. But the one I focus on in this book features the couple on this cover, Kathy Kirko, who I mentioned already, and her boyfriend, Roger Holder. Roger Holder was a Vietnam veteran, served 4 tours in Vietnam, had become disillusioned, had been in some legal trouble with the Army over a marijuana possession case, had gone AWOL upon arriving back in the U.S., and moved to San Diego, where his family was from. And he runs into Kathy Kirko from Coos Bay, Oregon, working in a massage parlor there, and just being a hippie and having a good time. And so it turns out that their paths had actually crossed as children, because Roger Holder's family had very briefly lived in Coos Bay. And so Roger, who was this great believer in astrology, felt this meant that they were meant to do something amazing together. And the thing he wants to do that's amazing is hijack a plane to liberate the imprisoned black radical Angela Davis. So I'm going to read you a little bit about the I'm going to take you to May 1972, where Roger Holder is plotting this hijacking to free Angela Davis, unbeknownst to his girlfriend, Kathy Kirko. While Kathy got ready to fly to Seattle on May 31st to visit her father, Roger Holder redoubled his efforts to finalize the Angela Davis plan. He pored over newspaper accounts of each recent skyjacking, taking note of what worked and what didn't. The month provided no shortage of intriguing case studies, including a pair of hijackings that took place on the same day. The first involved a young North Dakotan, recently drafted into the Army, who hijacked a Western Airlines flight from Salt Lake City to Havana. He did so with a note stating that he was just one of, quote, several heavily armed members of the anti-imperialist movement who are working to ensure that the skies of America will not be safe again until the U.S. government ceases its aggression against the people of Indochina. At almost the same exact moment, the hijacked Western plane touched down in Cuba. A 49-year-old Pennsylvanian named Frederick Hahnemann bailed out of an Eastern Airlines flight as it flew above northern Honduras. He carried with him $303,000 in ransom, obtained from the airline during a stop in Washington, D.C. Hahnemann vanished into the jungle amid rumors that he planned to donate the money to Marxist insurgents. But the more information Roger Holder compiled, the more muddled his planning became. He concocted at least 7 different skyjacking strategies of varying complexity, yet couldn't quite decide which one to pursue. He scribbled the step-by-step instructions for each scenario in his notebook, along with a list of alternate destinations for both himself and Angela Davis should the hijacking go awry. And he drafted the notes which he would use in the course of the skyjacking, trying to nail the right language and tone. As his notebook began to run out of blank pages, Holder gave his mission a name culled from Greek mythology: Operation Sisyphus, a reference to a sadistic king sentenced to spend eternity rolling a boulder up a hill. That weekend, Holder told Kirko they should go out for a special dinner, as he had something important to discuss with her. His parents chauffeured the couple to Anthony's Fish Grotto on North Harbor Drive, a San Diego institution known for its seafood cocktails. The meal was quite an extravagance given the sorry state of the couple's finances, but Holder swore there was good reason for the splurge. Midway through the dinner, he reached across the table and motioned for Kirko to take his hand. The moment had come for him to invite her to join Operation Sisyphus. Holder did not delve into too many operational details. Those were his responsibility and his alone. But he gave Kirko a rough idea of what he had in mind, beginning with his plan to hijack a Hawaii-bound jet from Los Angeles. He explained that such a plane would be guaranteed to have the range necessary for the mission. Once he had command of the plane, he would order it flown to San Francisco International Airport, where he would exchange half the passengers for Angela Davis and a sizable amount of money. They would then head for North Vietnam, stopping in Honolulu to refuel and release the remaining passengers. As they approached Hanoi, Holder would request that Prime Minister Pham Van Dong come to the airport to greet Davis and offer a political asylum. Once he knew Davis was in good hands, Holder would make a public show of donating the ransom money to a Viet Cong leader as a way of assuaging the guilt he felt over his role in the war. But the hijacking would not end in Hanoi. After dropping off Davis and the ransom, the couple would fly to Australia, where Holder claimed they would be allowed to homestead in the outback. They would get married and then send for his twin daughters, whom Kirko would help raise as her own. And they would live happily ever after. Kirko had never heard anything so incredibly far out. She had always known that Holder had a defiant streak, but this plan was the stuff of true rebellion. There was only one way she could possibly respond to such a deliciously extreme proposal. So, what do I wear to a hijacking? Now, as you can probably gather from the details of the plan, it wasn't really all that well thought out. It was certainly a little bit grandiose. And things start to go awry immediately. For starters, they are flying from San Diego to Hawaii with a stopover at LAX. They pay for their tickets with a bounced check. So when they get off the plane in Los Angeles, a United Airlines representative comes and tells them, "I'm sorry, you have to hand over your tickets." So now they're stuck in Los Angeles. The Angela Davis trial has just gone to the jury that day, and they have no money. And then Kathy Kirko realizes that in her purse, she has a round-trip ticket that her father had sent her on Western Airlines to visit him in Seattle. She had missed the flight. It had been 3 days earlier. But it wasn't a problem back in those days. She went to the ticket counter and cashed it in for 2 one-way tickets plus a refund because the trip from Los Angeles was shorter than the one from San Diego. And so they end up boarding Western Airlines Flight 701 from Los Angeles to Seattle. And I'm just going to give you a little vignette of what went down on the plane. Roger Holder was aching for a taste of marijuana. Just a few quick tokes to soothe his nerves. He had a cigarette pack full of joints in his breast pocket, but there was no way he could sneak a puff in the laboratory without attracting unwanted attention. He settled instead for a second round of bourbon, brought to him by a shapely blonde stewardess who said her name was Gina. A bump of turbulence caused her to splash some liquor on Holder's jacket, an accident for which he profusely apologized. "Don't worry about it at all," said Holder. "No harm done." Still, Gina Kutcher promised to bring him a dry cleaning voucher. Holder turned his head to watch her walk back to the aft galley, her comely figure sheathed in Western's flattering peach uniform. He briefly thought of asking this gorgeous lady to join him and Kathy on their journey, to become part of their happy band of homesteaders in the Australian outback. But he knew that it would be foolish to deviate from the plan. When Holder ran out of cigarettes, he bummed a smoke off the man sitting in seat 18E, an auto sales executive from suburban Seattle. The man used this exchange as an excuse to make small talk. He started the conversation by asking Holder how long he had been in the Army. "Oh, since before I was born," Holder responded with a laugh, before explaining that his father had spent his entire career in the military. That was the last true thing that Holder told his seatmate. He proceeded to weave a fantastic tale of daring do, claiming to be a helicopter pilot who had just emerged from the hospital after suffering grievous wounds in Vietnam. He said he had served in Korea, too, where he had been shot down after flying a secret bombing mission over the 38th parallel. He was heading to Seattle on a new gig with Army intelligence, a job he had earned by scoring a genius level 141 on an IQ test. Once his military career was over, he hoped to train police pilots in the art of evasive maneuvering. 4 rows behind Holder, Kathy Kirko was telling less outrageous lies to her seatmate, a middle-aged homemaker from Los Angeles. She said that she was traveling to Seattle for her father's surprise birthday party, and that she worked as a medical receptionist in San Diego. Soon thereafter, the man sitting across the aisle from Kirko roped her into a game of gin rummy, which she played quite shrewdly. As the plane passed over Oregon's Mount Hood, Holder felt an acute pang of self-doubt. He worried that he already waited too long to execute the takeover, a concern that sparked misgivings about the thoroughness of his preparations. He began to compose a new note for the captain, scribbling furiously on a sheet of yellow legal paper. But he stopped writing after 5 garbled paragraphs, unable to string together a coherent message. His thoughts were slipping away from him. Holder asked his seatmate for another cigarette and tried to read a life feature about Alabama governor and Democratic presidential candidate George Wallace, who had survived an assassin's bullet on May 15th. Though he maintained a veneer of cool, he was desperately trying to muster the courage to go through with his plan. At around 2:25 p.m., the captain's voice blared over the public address system. He directed the passengers' attention to the snow-capped Mount Rainier, which was coming up on the left side of the aircraft. All was running smoothly, he added, and they would be on the ground in Seattle in 25 minutes. Holder closed his magazine and stubbed out his cigarette. Now or never, he thought. Now or never. He removed his Samsonite briefcase from beneath the seat in front of him and replaced it with his small black valise. He opened the briefcase a crack and removed a travel-size alarm clock. He wound it up and placed it back inside the briefcase. "Could you watch my seat?" Holder asked the auto-sales executive in seat 18E. With that, he rose and walked down the aisle toward the rear of the plane. Kirko watched him pass by. This was it. Holder pulled back the aft galley's red curtain to find 3 stewardesses shoveling beef and broccoli into their mouths. The lovely Gina Kutcher stood closest to him. "Oh no," thought Kutcher, "the dry cleaning voucher. I forgot about his voucher." "I need to show you something," Holder said to her, placing 2 sheets of 3x5 notepaper on the galley's countertop. "Read these." The puzzled Kutcher began to read. The first sheet contained a neatly handwritten message, marred by numerous capitalization and spelling quirks. But there was no mistaking its meaning. It read, "Success through death. Everyone except the captain will leave the cabin. There are 4 of us and 2 bombs. Do as you're told and no shooting will take place. Your co-pilot and navigator are to leave the cabin 4 paces apart. Take seats to the rear of the aircraft. Place aircraft on audio pilot. Place your hands on top of your head. Leave the cabin door open. Signed, Weatherman, SDS of California. You have 2 minutes, sir." The other sheet of paper was filled with a diagram of what appeared to be a briefcase. Several rectangles of varying size, each labeled with a number from 1 to 4, were sketched inside the drawing. A column of text to the left of the diagram explained the briefcase's contents. It read, 4 men, 3 guns, and 2 bombs. 1. Plastic explosive, C4, U.S. Army explosives. 2. Clock. 3. Batteries. 4. 1 concussion grenade, 1 second delays after pin is pulled. Keep smiling. Flip over. Kutcher turned the note over. There was just one more sentence. To the captain, and don't stop. The man raised his left hand so the stewardess could see that he was holding a black Samsonite briefcase. A thin piece of copper wire snaked from its top right by the handle. It was connected to a metal ring draped around Holder's left index finger. He made a show of rhythmically tapping the briefcase with his right hand, as if to say, "In here." Holder elbowed his way past Kutcher and stepped into the galley. He leaned against the countertop, pushed his glasses up to the bridge of his nose, and locked eyes with Kutcher. Every trace of kindness was now gone from his gaze. "You have 2 minutes," he said. Kutcher did not hesitate to obey the note's final instruction. She headed for the cockpit. So I'll leave you with that cliffhanger and ask if you have any questions. So please, anyone, golden age of hijacking questions? Yes.
So what's a typical criminal penalty for the ones who wound up in jail? How long do they spend?
So it's a great question. Initially, they weren't too severe. You have ones that started in the 60s where people would serve like 2 or 3 years in prison and get out. By the time this happens, in 1972, the epidemic has gotten so crazy, and there's like people being killed in these hijackings, often by the FBI by accident, but there are people being killed. And then you have people being sentenced to life in prison, 30, 40, 45 years in prison as the epidemic wore on. Yes?
I was intrigued by the details of how you get so specific. How much time do you spend researching and reporting, and how do you know what kind of food they were eating on the plane?
Yeah, so basically, especially that hijacking stuff, I try to track on every single person I could. So, you know, I interviewed both the hijacker, Roger Holder, and Gina Kutcher, the stewardess he was thinking about bringing to Australia because she was so beautiful. And I interviewed pretty much everyone I could. There was, 6 people who passed through the cockpit of that plane. 5 of them were alive as I wrote in the book, and I interviewed all 5. Mm-hmm. So it was really important for me to do that. And the other thing that was really helpful to me was the FBI documents. I used the Freedom of Information Act. to get about 4,000 documents from the FBI in particular, and FAA and State Department. And those are great because obviously memories fade away over time, but these were interviews done like literally the night of the hijacking with released hostages. So they're really useful to me. And there was actually another pilot involved in this who, when I met him in Arizona to interview him, he had a manila folder that was about like that thick. And he was like, just take this, I don't need it anymore. And I was like, okay. And it was the handwritten notes all the crew had given to the FBI, plus the full transcript of the
Oh my God.
of the communication from the plane to
Wow. Wow.
yeah, that was a big find for me.
Great find.
Yeah. Yes.
I don't remember exactly. I used to remember, but where the plane was hijacked and there was that famous picture of the guy who had a gun to the pilot's head.
Yeah, 1985, TWA in Beirut.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the pilot was basically saying, you know, get out of my face or something like that, sound like that. Anyway, after that, because that was miserable for the for those people on that plane.
Yeah.
I mean, they couldn't get off to use restrooms or anything. So after that, did planes start doing any accommodations in the event of such a thing happening? Did they start doing anything
Well,
to the
that
planes?
so that hijack in particular is a little bit outside the purview of this book. First of all, that took place abroad. So this really my book focuses more on like the America.
Right. Okay.
But that was a very important event because I feel that's a big reason we don't remember this time period of hijacking, because like that hijacking, which I remember as a child,
right.
kind of rebranded hijacking as a tool of Islamic militants.
Yeah.
So we kind of forgot that it was actually a domestic crime wave associated with this. Certainly, it wasn't very common for hostages to be held for 2 weeks like those hostages were.
Oh, was it 2 weeks?
Yeah, it was 2 weeks actually that some of those people were held on that plane.
Wow.
Which probably pretty miserable.
Oh.
Generally, the longest these would last would be like 24 hours.
Yeah.
But generally, they're much quicker than this. This plane was seized at 2:25, and the last hostages were gone, within 12 hours, basically, 12 to 14 hours. This was a particularly dramatic hijacking, but they released half the hostages in San Francisco and half at JFK in New York.
How many people were on the flight?
I think it's 90, not including crew. In the back.
Yeah. Does your book cover D.C. Cooper, the guy that's...
D.B. Cooper, yeah, it does.
Back or whatever?
Yes, so the fascinating thing about D.B. Cooper is that he actually was not the first guy to get the idea to jump out of the plane. There was this guy 11 days earlier, a Canadian guy named Paul Joseph Sinney, who had the bright idea that, like, I can actually get away with this if I parachute out of the plane. And he hijacked this Air Canada flight and pretended he was a member of the IRA, and, like, he got $50,000, and he was flying back over Alberta, and he said, open the door, I'm going to jump out of the plane. And he made one fatal error, is that he had his parachute in a brown paper parcel that he tied up, and he tied the knot so tightly that he couldn't unwrap it. And so he asked one of the pilots, like, do you have anything sharp I can use to open up my parachute? And so the pilot brings him the plane's fire axe. Planes used to have fire axes, believe it or not. And the pilot hands it to him, and Paul Joseph Sinney, who was, by the way, was drinking the entire in the hijacking, puts down his shotgun and lifts up his arms to take the fire axe. And the pilot's like, really?
Really?
And just whacks him over the head with the fire axe. So he would have been D.B. Cooper unless he hadn't been so wasted. I do talk about D.B. Cooper. Obviously, they found some of his money. I was talking to earlier some people about this. I talked to a lot of pilots and skydivers about him, and not one person I talked to said he could possibly have survived that jump, because they all gathered like he had no idea what he was doing. He jumped like in his suit with wingtips on, with a non-steerable parachute into a hailstorm from a Boeing 727 going like full tilt. So I think my personal theory is that he like died on the way down, ended up on one of those 100-foot tall fir trees along the Columbia River, and was like eaten by buzzards. But then gets to be a folk hero because no one ever found him. So. And they wrote some great songs about him, and like he was definitely lionized.
Right.
Yes.
I've seen you quoted elsewhere that you storyboarded this instead of outlining.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could sort of talk about what that looks like and how you think that produced a different kind of book than otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always hated outlining, and so I got the idea of storyboard. I was adapting my first book for a screenplay, and I wanted something more visual. So I just got a bunch of images and kind of arranged them in the sequence of the where I thought the screenplay should go. And I realized it was like this eureka moment of like, this actually makes me think about storytelling in a much more cinematic way, and I kind of like guide the reader with much more assuredness, I feel like. So what I ended up doing is getting a little over 200 images and sequencing them exactly the plot of this book. Now, some of those images are like, screenshots of newspaper headlines. Some of them are like snippets from the transcript from the hijacked flight. Some of them are stock images of things that I couldn't find a real image for. So it's not really for public consumption, but I think it was really useful to me as an outline. And the other thing it could do, to really geek out on the writing aspect, is that sometimes I'll get stuck on on writing, and I'll just be like, well, I can just skip to the next image and write a paragraph and worry about the transition between these two things. Make the glue between them later. It's just a way to keep myself going. But it was really valuable to me, and actually I'm doing it now for magazine pieces as well. So yeah, it's been a huge thing for me, definitely. Yes.
How long did this project take?
I started in October 2009, so it's almost 4 years, I guess you could say. It's time consuming.
Yeah. You said you interviewed some of the hijackers themselves.
I interviewed, yes.
Were they remorseful for what they did, or were they just angry that they got caught?
So I interviewed him. I interviewed Roger Holder. I interviewed him at great length. He had complex feelings about his hijacking.
Where is he today?
He actually passed away while I was writing the book, but I found him in San Diego. So he had remorse, but his remorse was actually over the fact that it had kind of destroyed his relationship with his family. When he did this, the reason he went into the army in the first place, to Vietnam, was he had young twin daughters. He had gotten his high school sweetheart pregnant, and she'd had twins when he was 17, so he lied about his age and went into the army and was riding a tank through the jungle when he was 18. So he regretted that. I think also that he missed this part of his life because he definitely thought that he was destined for great things, and this was the one time in his life that the eyes of the world were upon him, and he was doing something. When I interviewed him, he was living in a studio apartment in a kind of rundown neighborhood in San Diego doing nothing, really. So I think it was he was nostalgic for this in a certain way as well. He had very complex feelings about it that were not totally coherent because he was also a little bit crazy.
Was he in prison for?
He did serve some time in prison, yes. Yes. Not a lot of time, but he did serve some time. Anyone else? Yep.
Did he read the book before passing away, or did it not?
No, he didn't, unfortunately. I would have liked. So what happened is he passed away, and after he passed away, his girlfriend, actually his common-law wife, really, sent me his unfinished memoirs. His memoirs a little bit. His fragmentary memoirs that he'd been trying to write for many years. He had actually had some bad luck with his memoirs. He'd been living in France in the early 80s. And had writing some memoirs. He was living at a chateau in northern France and hanging out with Joan Baez in northern France.
Wow.
And he had suddenly just freaked out and burned his memoirs and run away. And then in the early 90s, something had happened that I talk about in the book where he got in some trouble with the FBI and they seized his memoirs. So he'd been working on it for a long time to kind of stake his role in history. And I feel like his common-law wife, who was the person who cared about him the most and really took care of him for the last 20 years of his life, essentially, really thought it'd be valuable because he really wanted his story to be told.
Maybe you'll hear from Joan Baez one of these days.
It's funny. So I tried to contact her, and I made one of the dumbest reporting mistakes of my life is that I contacted her representative. She's like, well, why do you want to speak to Joan? I was like, I'm writing a book about a hijacker she used to know. It's like, yeah, we'll get back to you. So I should have been a little more opaque about what I was doing.
She's a lovely lady.
That's what I've heard, yeah.
Yeah, so, she goes to various political events, so probably if you're ever around,
Maybe I should try
talk
that,
to her. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
In going from the New York Times article to the couple who you ended up basing the book on, was there anyone else who was almost the subject of the book?
No, there really wasn't. I mean, it was pretty quick because there's something about her being a woman and just like her background just jumped out at me. I think the real moment when I realized it was a book was when I found out their paths had crossed as children. Because that was like too much of a coincidence to like, I was like, this can't be real, but I found lots of documentation, interviewed him and his sister, so it was true. So I just knew it was a book after that coincidence. It became clear to me. Yes.
Now, as a writer, like this treasure trove of goodies that they gave you, like the pilot interviews and all this and that. So as a writer, then do you just put that in your little treasure chest for future, or is that something for your kids someday? Or
Yeah, so this stuff has been moved into the. I kind of think about like that last shot of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they like put the Ark of the Covenant on like the big storage unit and like never to be seen again. All this stuff is now in my closet in Queens, probably never to be taken off the shelf. I think I need to move on to the next thing.
Yeah, but it's still pretty interesting. It brings to mind what does happen to these things of history that become part of the culture, and then.
Well, it's cool to have the original artifacts. I mean,
Yeah.
like, I definitely want to preserve
Right.
them. I
Right.
should probably put a tarp over them because it's got a leaky roof above it. So.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you so much. I'll sign books if you got them, but thank you a million. Thanks so much for coming out. Really appreciate it.
If you would like to get a copy of the book, we have them up at the front, and we're actually going to move to the back.
Fantastic.
Yeah.